There's something most of us carry as we grow older, but we rarely speak of it. Not at church, not at dinner, not even with our closest friends. It's the quiet fear that settles in the background of our days. Sometimes it arrives as a question we don't want to answer. What will happen to me as I keep getting older? Other times, it shows up as silence, an ache we can't quite name, a worry we brush aside with a half smile and a change of subject. But today, we're going to speak the thing aloud. We're going to talk about the fears that come with aging. Not to make them heavier, but to make them less lonely. Because the truth is, you're not the only one who feels this way. And when we shine a light on fear, it often softens. Let's start with a simple fact. According to multiple studies, more than 60% of adults over 65 report experiencing some form of anxiety about aging. And yet, less than 10% have ever shared those feelings openly, even with family. Why? Because we've been taught to stay strong, to be grateful, to not make a fuss. But pretending not to be afraid doesn't make the fear go away. It just makes it lonelier. And it's time we changed that. So let me ask you something. Have you ever been afraid of becoming a burden? Have you ever wondered what would happen if your body failed you, or your memory? Have you worried about being forgotten, or overlooked, or simply no longer needed? You're not alone. These are fears that live quietly in the hearts of many seniors, not because they are weak, but because they are real. Let's talk about what we don't usually say out loud. Fear of losing control. Fear of losing dignity. Fear of becoming invisible in a world that moves too fast. Fear of being left behind, while others live their busy, full lives. And sometimes, fear of the end itself. These fears aren't signs of failure. They're signs that we are still deeply human, still deeply aware, still connected to life and all that it means. The more we love living, the more we fear losing it. That's not weakness. That's truth. Let me tell you about Harold. Harold is 77, a retired bus driver, widower, grandfather of 4. He told me once, "I'm not afraid of dying, really. I'm afraid of not mattering before I do." It hit me like a stone in the chest. Because Harold's words echo what so many feel, but don't say. It's not just the body changing. It's the roles disappearing. The purpose getting blurry. The fear that you've become an extra in a world where you used to be the main character. And that fear? That's the one we need to name. Because when we name it, we can begin to shift it. So grab a cup of tea, sit with me a while, and stay through the end. You might just hear something that speaks a truth you've carried quietly for years. Why do we need to talk about these fears now? Because silence creates shame. When we hide our fears, we start to believe we're the only ones who have them. And that's never true. Fear of aging is not something to be embarrassed about. It's something to explore, with compassion, with courage, and with community. And that starts by saying, "Yes, I feel this too." Maybe your fear isn't dramatic. Maybe it's a whisper. Maybe it's the moment you ask someone to help you with a jar you used to open yourself. Maybe it's when you forget a word in conversation and your heart skips a beat. Maybe it's walking into a room and wondering if anyone sees you anymore. Those moments matter, not because they define you, but because they remind you something is changing. And it's okay to feel something about that. You are allowed to feel afraid, but you're not meant to feel alone. That's why this conversation exists, to offer space, to offer honesty, to offer the kind of company that comes not from advice, but from understanding. Because fear doesn't shrink when we ignore it. It softens when we speak it, and even more when we're heard. In the parts ahead, you'll hear real stories from real seniors, just like you. Stories of fear, of loss, of uncertainty, but also stories of resilience, of rediscovery, of quiet strength. Because if fear lives in the dark, courage grows in the light. For now, just let this truth rest in your chest. There is nothing wrong with me for feeling this way. My fears are part of my wisdom. You are not broken. You are not weak. You are still here, and your feelings deserve to be honored. Let's keep going. What comes next might surprise you. There's something healing about hearing someone else speak your fear out loud. Suddenly, you're not the only one lying awake at night, wondering what happens if your legs give out, or your memory fades, or the people you love start building lives that no longer have space for you. In this part of our conversation, we're not trying to solve those fears. We're simply going to give them names, because sometimes naming a fear is the first step to loosening its grip. Let's take this slowly. Let's look gently at the quiet fears many seniors carry, and maybe, just maybe, you'll hear a reflection of your own. Fear number 1, the fear of losing independence. This one is almost universal. It's not just about driving or cooking or getting dressed. It's about the feeling of agency, of being able to choose your own path, on your own terms. Many seniors fear becoming dependent, not because they don't trust their loved ones, but because they don't want to become someone else's problem. I don't want to be a burden. You've heard it. Maybe you've said it. But underneath that fear is something even deeper. The fear of losing yourself. The truth is, independence is not only physical, it's also emotional, mental, spiritual. And even when your body begins to slow down, your voice still matters. Fear number 2, the fear of being forgotten. Not suddenly, but slowly. The calls come less often. The invitations stop arriving. The calendar starts to look a little too empty. You used to be someone people relied on, asked advice from, needed. Now you wonder, would they even notice if you weren't here? This fear often grows quietly. It doesn't shout. It whispers. In the pauses, in the long evenings, in the silence after, "I'll call you later." But let me remind you, your presence still carries weight. You are not invisible. Even if the world has gotten noisier, there are people who need your stories, your perspective, your presence. And yes, they may need reminding, but that doesn't make you less real. Fear number 3, the fear of decline, body and mind. This one is raw because we feel it. You stand up and your knees protest. You reach for a word and it slips through your fingers. You look in the mirror and don't quite recognize the face staring back. There's grief here, not just for what's gone, but for what might be next. What if I can't live on my own anymore? What if I forget my grandchildren's names? What if I become someone I don't recognize? These fears are hard to voice, even to doctors. And sometimes the fear isn't about death. It's about the days before that, when you're still here, but not fully you. That's a fear worth honoring. Not to feed it, but to say, I see this too, and it matters. Fear number 4, the fear of outliving everyone you love. Few people talk about this, but many seniors live through it. You go to more funerals than weddings. You lose the people who knew you before, the ones who laughed at your stories before you even finished them, the ones who held your hand without needing a reason. And you're left with a strange emptiness, not just grief, but the loneliness of being the last chapter in a story filled with people who are no longer here. And yet, somehow, you're still here, still breathing, still carrying their love, still trying to figure out how to fill the space they left behind. That's not weakness. That's sacred endurance. Fear number 5, the fear of regret. This one doesn't get talked about much either, but many people, quietly, in the stillness, ask, did I live fully enough? Did I love boldly enough? Did I waste too much time worrying? There's a sadness that creeps in with age, not just about the body changing, but about the chances not taken, the forgiveness not given, the joy postponed. But here's the truth. It's not too late to make peace with your story, not by rewriting it, but by loving it for what it is. You did the best you could with what you had and what you knew, and that is enough. Let's take a breath. That was a lot. But here's the most important part. You don't have to carry these fears alone. Every one of these worries has been felt before, by someone in your neighborhood, your building, your family, your generation. You are not broken for feeling them. You are wise for naming them. And as we move forward, we're going to hear the voices of real seniors who felt exactly these same fears and found their own ways to live with them. You don't have to be fearless to move forward. You just have to be honest. And you've already taken the first step. Let's keep going. What comes next might bring you the comfort you didn't know you needed. There's something powerful about hearing another person say, "Me too." Not as a slogan, not as a cliché, but as a moment of recognition, heart to heart, truth to truth. In this part of our journey, we're not going to talk about fear. We're going to witness it through the voices of real seniors who were willing to speak what many of us only whisper. Because when we listen, not just with our ears, but with our hearts, we begin to understand that fear doesn't isolate us. It connects us. Meet Louise, age 83, former librarian. "I used to think I was doing fine," she said. "Independent, still driving, still going to church every Sunday." But one day, while walking into the grocery store, she fell. Nothing dramatic, just a simple misstep. She was okay, a few bruises, a sore wrist. "But what shook me," she said, "was not the fall. It was how quickly I went from being fine to being fragile." Since then, she's avoided going out alone. I hate that. I hate that I now hesitate, that I now think twice. I feel like a child again, needing permission, needing protection, and that scares me more than falling ever did. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but she didn't ask for sympathy. She just wanted someone to know. Then there's Thomas, 76, retired contractor, widower. "I go days without speaking out loud," he admitted. He chuckled, but it wasn't funny. "After my wife passed, the house just fell silent. My kids are busy. My friends, well, they're mostly gone or fading. I never thought I'd feel invisible in my own life. But that's the word. Invisible." He paused, then added, "It's not the loneliness that gets me. It's the feeling that no one would notice if I disappeared." And yet, even in that honesty, there was strength, because Thomas spoke his fear. And in doing so, he became visible again. Now, meet Rosa. 71, cancer survivor, piano teacher. Rosa's fear was more complicated. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of getting bitter before then. "Sometimes I catch myself resenting younger people," she said. "How fast they move, how little they see us. And that scares me, because that's not who I want to become." Her vulnerability was disarming. I want to stay kind. I want to stay soft. But it's hard when the world keeps overlooking you. But here's what Rosa did that changed everything. She started a small seniors story circle at her local library. Once a month, we just talk. No agenda, no lectures, just space to be heard. She said it's the most human she's felt in years. Each of these voices has something in common. They didn't try to fix their fears. They spoke them. They honored them. And they found others willing to hold space with them. That's intimacy. That's courage. That's the quiet work of aging with grace. You don't have to be fearless to be honest. You don't have to smile through every hard moment. You're allowed to say, "This is hard." You're allowed to say, "I'm scared." You're allowed to say, "I miss who I used to be." And when you do, something begins to shift. You move from being alone with your fear to being accompanied inside your truth. Maybe you haven't said it out loud yet. That's okay, but let me ask you now gently. What's the fear you've carried the longest, but shared the least? Just thinking about the answer is a step toward healing. And when the time is right, you'll know who to tell. A friend, a journal, a prayer. There's no right way to share, only your way. Sometimes the bravest thing we do is speak the truth out loud, even if our voice shakes. And that's what each of these seniors did. They didn't pretend to be fine. They didn't rush to find silver linings. They simply said, "This is what's real for me. This is what hurts. This is what I hope still matters." And in that honesty, they began to feel human again. Seen, heard, understood. What about you? What part of you is still waiting to be spoken? What fear needs a little air and a little grace? You don't have to shout it. You don't even have to explain it. But you can begin to listen to it. Not to give it power, but to give it peace. So here we are, witnesses to truth, carriers of compassion, ready perhaps to step forward, not because we're no longer afraid, but because we're no longer hiding. Let's keep going. What comes next might help you see fear not as a weight, but as a teacher. What if fear wasn't the enemy? What if fear was a signal, not of weakness, but of awareness, of care, of being deeply alive? You see, for many of us, the fears we've explored, the fear of being forgotten, the fear of losing control, the fear of outliving love, those aren't signs that we're fading. They're signs that we still feel, still care, still hope, and maybe, just maybe, they're pointing us towards something deeper. This part of the journey is about reframing, about looking again, not to deny what's hard, but to see what's hidden inside it. Because sometimes, the thing we fear the most is also the thing we're most ready to grow into. What if growing older is not about becoming less, but about becoming more true? You no longer need to prove yourself. You've done the building, the raising, the providing, the striving. Now, aging invites you to shed the armor and step into your essence. The world may call it slowing down, but what if it's really deepening? Less rush, more reflection, less noise, more clarity, less performance, more presence. Let's go back to Louise, the librarian who feared becoming fragile. In our last conversation, she said something I haven't forgotten. I used to think strength was being able to do everything by myself. Now I'm learning that strength is being able to ask for help without shame. She smiled, then added, "Turns out there's a quiet dignity in needing others, and in letting them need you too." That's a reframe, not from fear to fake optimism, but from fear to freedom. Freedom from the myth that you have to do this alone. Thomas, the widower who feared invisibility, began keeping a journal. "I don't write for anyone else," he told me. "I write to remember that I'm still here." He started leaving notes in library books. Small lines like, "You are not too old to begin again. Someone like you has lived through worse and come out brighter. This page is for you, because you're still turning them." He doesn't know if anyone reads them, but he writes them, and in doing so he's left behind his invisibility and walked into contribution. Sometimes the reframe is simple, from "I'm fading" to "I still have something to give." And Rosa, the one who feared becoming bitter, she's found her own rhythm. "Every time I feel that edge of resentment rise," she said, "I try to meet it with beauty." She listens to classical music in the morning. She names her fears out loud when no one's home. She sends postcards, not texts, not emails, but handwritten notes, just because. "This stage of life," she said, "is not about trying to be who I used to be. It's about becoming the elder I wish I'd had." That too is a reframe, not just of aging, but of identity. So here's the question I want to offer you now. What if the fear you carry isn't a wall, but a doorway? A doorway into softness, a doorway into perspective, a doorway into the most authentic version of yourself. You are not what you used to be, but you are also not finished becoming. And the version of you that's emerging now? She's wiser, he's kinder, they're freer. Let's talk about legacy, not as a monument, but as a presence. Many of us think of legacy as something we leave behind. But what if it's also something you live right now? Every time you listen without interrupting, every time you speak your truth with tenderness, every time you choose to stay soft instead of shutting down, that is your legacy, unfolding in real time. You're not writing your last chapter. You're writing your most honest one. You are not your fear. You are the one brave enough to name it. And in doing so, you've reclaimed your power. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that holds steady. You've turned toward the mirror, not with critique, but with compassion. You've looked your fear in the face and said, "You don't get to run my life." That's courage, and it deserves to be honored. So breathe into this truth with me now. I am not aging into obscurity. I am aging into meaning. There may be grief, there may be goodbyes, but there is also grace. And when you walk through that doorway, not in spite of your fear, but alongside it, you'll find something waiting. Peace, clarity, the quiet joy of knowing who you are. Let's keep going. What comes next might just feel like coming home. So here we are, not at the end, but at the beginning of a new relationship with your fear, with your voice, with yourself. You've walked through quiet rooms of truth. You've looked gently at the places that tremble. You've listened to others speak the words you were afraid to say. And maybe, in all of that, something inside you softened, or stirred, or sighed with relief. Let this final part be your pause, your breath, your blessing, because aging, in all its depth and difficulty, is not a story of decline. It's a story of becoming. You are not a problem to be solved. You are a story still unfolding. Too often, society sees older adults as statistics, as tasks to manage, as people who've had their time. But your time is not past. It is present. It is pulsing with meaning, right here, right now. And the very fact that you're here, listening, reflecting, breathing through these truths, that alone says something sacred. I am still growing. I am still worthy of becoming. Your fears do not make you weak. They make you aware. They mean you still care, still hope, still feel connected to the people, memories, and moments that made you who you are. And yes, those fears may still visit you from time to time, but they don't get to tell the whole story, not anymore. You are not alone in this. Not ever. The voices you heard in this video, Louise, Thomas, Rosa, and more, are not extraordinary. They're just brave enough to be honest. And maybe now, so are you. Somewhere out there, someone else is carrying the same ache in silence. And maybe your story, your voice, your vulnerability could be the lantern they've been searching for. So speak when you're ready. Write, share. Remember, you don't need a platform, just a willingness to show up real. This is your invitation, not to perform strength, but to live your truth. To say, I'm not fine, but I'm here. I'm scared sometimes, but I'm still curious. I don't know everything, but I know this matters. And most of all, I am not done. I am still becoming. Let that be your rhythm. Let that be your rest. And now, take this final moment with me. Gently, place your hand over your chest. Close your eyes, if you'd like. And with each breath, let these words sink in. Not just in your mind, but in your bones. I have not failed by being afraid. I have grown by facing what's real. I am aging, not out of life, but deeper into it. Breathe again, slower this time. Let peace rise up in you, not because everything is easy, but because you are no longer hiding from yourself. You are not aging out of purpose. You are aging into presence, the kind of presence that doesn't chase approval, that doesn't need applause. That just is. Quiet, steady, real. That is enough. So here's my final blessing for you. May your fears no longer isolate you. May they teach you how to love more gently. May they point you toward the people who understand. May they remind you that courage doesn't mean never shaking. It means showing up even when you do. And may you always remember this. You are still becoming. You are still becoming. You are still becoming.